welcome back to all of you. You'd think that these two sessions, this last one and this one, are perhaps not connected, but I'm going to make the claim that data is in fact the new gold. And in the previous era, oil was the new gold, and then of course gold was the gold standard. But those connections, what we learned from our last panel in terms of how you need to start local to solve the sort of globalizing problems, the speed at which that's necessary, and wasn't Vanessa Nakase impressive? Wasn't that really a call to action? She's a Gates Global Goalkeeper. She won the Goalkeeper Award last year, and I'm so privileged to be in that circle of goalkeepers with her because she always holds our feet to the fire and holds our feet to action. So let's have one more applause for that last panel. But data, again, is the goal of our era currently. Owning it, storing it, manipulating it, figuring out how it will power, shift, and radically disrupt our lives, from the Internet of Things to AI, which we experience almost daily now. The ubiquity of data is everywhere, and who owns it, what constitutes privacy in this era, has now become, of course, the focus of ethicists, of legal scholars, but truthfully also has to be the focus of our everyday. And I wanted to ask you, Deborah, you're next gen. I am a digital migrant, and hence a data migrant. When you think about privacy and the way that your data is used, how do you think about that? How do you think about giving away your personal information, whether it's to a corporation or to government? What guides your thinking?
Well, we're always called digital natives, but I think even for us, the awareness of where our data is even collected. I mean, there's some obvious points, of course, but there's also a lot of spaces where we maybe not think about, okay, that data is actually being collected right now. And then also, where is this data really used, or in which ways is it really used? Who has access to it? I mean, if I go to one page, one website, and then click there on, yeah, you can use my data for X, Y, Z, so quite specifically, then still I'm never quite sure, is that where it ends, or is it going further? Then also, I try to do the little things, or the most convenient things, let's say, to sort of limit the data that's being collected on me. But of course, there's a limit to, the balance between comfort and of me not wanting my data to be used, and then also, I guess, sometimes a little bit a question of patience and stressful situations where you maybe don't have time to click 4 times for cookies not to be.
And you're suddenly giving away, as we say in American English, the whole kit and caboodle.
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, so you see what nexus we're going to address here, but it addresses that 30,000-foot level. We know that privacy concerns between American corporations and European lawmakers have ended in Schrem's lawsuit after Schrem's lawsuit after Schrem's lawsuit, to now we have sort of an equanimity of decision-making, at least a pause in that standoff. So it's the 30,000-foot level, and it's Deborah's private decisions on where her data goes. But then conversely, when we heard this morning Desmond Lee talk about how useful it is to have the interpersonal data and to have the governance data to deliver better public services, so clearly we're going to have to continue negotiating these questions. The good news is that we don't have to negotiate these questions. That's what the next panel is for. So over to our next panel. Thanks very much.
Buck stops here.
Welcome to this discussion on privacy, which impacts every one of us. I think everything that we do, from scratching our head to buying a shoe, is a data point. and that data is useful to somebody. Perhaps us, and perhaps an institution, perhaps a policymaker, perhaps a company. So this afternoon, we are going to be looking at the various dimensions of privacy and data. Let me do a quick introduction. John Denton is Secretary General, International Chamber of Commerce. Professor MarianaValente, she's also an expert on regulatory practices. And Keith Enright of a little-known company called Google. He's the Chief Privacy Officer. We're going to explore privacy, and there is a lot of reference to data as oil or gold, as we heard, but there is another narrative. My data is not your gold. My data is not your oil. So what is data actually, and what are the privacy issues around it? We'll explore the data part, but I want to begin by asking Mariana to help us understand today, in 2023, what is the definition of privacy?
Easy question. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, everyone who's showed up. So a modern conception of privacy goes far beyond just a negative vision of privacy, just a vision that would state privacy as the right to be left alone or to have personal space. Privacy is understood nowadays as very important for self-determination, that is an active content, so that subjects can determine who they are. And I think that when we're faced with digital technologies, that's more and more the case, right? So it's easy to think of cases where that could go wrong. So for example, if you think of places where the LGBT community is singled out and criminalized, using data to personal data to find these people, to criminalize these people, is clearly a violation of this self-determination, of determining who you are, who you love, how you live. But of course, we can also think of cases that became pretty prominent recently. So you might have heard of this case of this 41-year-old mother in the United States whose conversation with her daughter was delivered by Facebook to law enforcement against a court order because she was speaking about sexual reproduction measures in a state where abortion had just been prohibited. So we're speaking of also the use of data that's produced at one point in time, let's say, and that can be used in another point in time. And this is also, I think, very important for the conversation in the symposium. That's the intergenerational contract, right? But just going beyond individual cases, I think when we're speaking of this active concept of privacy and digital technologies, one thing that's really important is profiling. The profiles, which are like digital selves that are built out of data that's collected in everything we do. So this is what you were mentioning, right? When you like something, when you search for something, or just your behavior generally, or the behavior of people around you also. Sometimes it's not even something that you're actively producing. That's also producing profiles, and that can have an effect on the kinds of opportunities that are shown to you. So on the capabilities that you can develop, let's say this profile determines that certain jobs are shown to you and certain jobs are not shown. And so we're speaking of things that go far beyond privacy. We're also speaking of things that refer to other social goals and our possibilities of developing talent and capabilities. So I think that that's the answer, right? That's like the difficult answer to this question.
Do you think that civil society today across the world, I know it's a sweeping statement, but do you think we are more aware about the importance and perhaps the fear of privacy? Do we understand the concept of privacy today? Because a few years ago, we would give our data. There are 3 types of data that we willingly give to a public platform. Second is what the government forces us to give. Not forces, actually. It's part of a policy statement that, well, your national identity is a data as well. And third type of data is where somebody is monitoring you, your activity, and has picked up data about you without your knowledge. Mm-hmm. do you think today that civil society is more aware of those issues?
I think so. I think that there's a common sense that people nowadays don't care about privacy, especially young people, because we're giving away so much, right? But I think people are making trade-offs all the time of the benefits that they get out of sharing information all the time. So of course I get benefits out of sharing information to an app that later shows me content that interests me more than like any content that I could just randomly access, or that when I access a map that things that might be interesting in a certain city are shown to me. So I think people are consciously giving their data for benefits. So I think the question should go beyond that, right? Of course, there are many measures that we could think individually for people to follow. So for example, encrypt your communications, use encrypted apps, don't give out so much information, right? But because there are these trade-offs, I think the conversation has to go much deeper. And then we have to get to the conversation of regulation, right? Of data minimization, of practices, of business models, of what regulators should do, of what corporations should do when it comes to privacy. Because if these trade-offs are shown to people like that, of course, they're going to be balancing and seeing that there are also benefits.
There is a contradiction here also, John, and I'm going to come to you as the head of the
great contradictor.
International Chamber of Commerce. Our rights and behavior as a citizen are very different from our behavior as a consumer. There is that conflict between a consumer and a citizen. As a consumer, I'm happy to give you everything, as long as you give me the product and service that I really want. Mass customization, for example. Mass customization can only work if everything about me is known to a product or service delivery company. How does industry see this data flow coming in? Do you see this contradiction? Data is, of course, important to industry, but what is your approach?
Well, let's come back to that contradiction. I'm going to be that annoying person on the panel who's going to take, I think, exception to the way in which the whole session was introduced. The introductory comments identified data in the same context of this notion that data is the new oil, data is the new gold, data is the new uranium. It is absolutely preposterous to describe data in those terms. In fact, the description and the manipulation of data into that form is actually at the root of the challenge we're having in coming up with commonly accepted and trusted approaches to ensuring the efficient flow of data. Because what it does is it confuses data as this kind of natural resource, which is capable of geopolitical rivalry, to what it actually is, which is actually a facilitator, an enabler. And it actually is very amorphous. And this kind of nonsense that there's this kind of dichotomy as well is just almost so extraordinarily simplistic, it must have been generated at the World Economic Forum. Oh, sorry. But, I mean, the reality is...
They're watching.
Well, they're always watching me. Because one of the problems is we've got to rebuild trust here. And to pronounce on these things in these very simplistic and attractive terms in terms of sound bites is actually causing immeasurable challenge to what we're trying to do here, which is to enable the effective use of data to support the development of society. That's what it is. And also, I just come back to what you said before, and I couldn't agree more, because what you were, I think, really picking up, this dichotomy between public and private, there's more dichotomies that need to be thought about as well. There's proprietary and there's open. There's confidential and non-confidential. There's all sorts of things that need to be considered when you talk about the use of data, the way in which it's felt by people as well and by companies. But at its heart is this kind of nonsensical, but also quite destructive framing of data in the terms that were used to actually introduce this session and have been picked up, obviously, by, I suppose, people spruiking their own business if they're going to do an IPO, etc. So when I look at it as a business person, I sit on investment boards, I run the International Chamber of Commerce, we're at 160 countries, more than 70% of us are in the global south. So I think about this in inclusive terms, and the fundamental issue that goes to privacy for me is trust. Now, I can tell you a personal story about trust, and you asked a question about changing attitudes. I can be in business and also in civil society. I am ultimately a citizen, though as an Australian, I discovered that a lot of my rights as a citizen were taken away during COVID because they forbade me from returning back to my country. That was an aspect of the Australian citizenship law I was unfamiliar with, and apparently so were the legislators, because it was actually unconstitutional. But you think about this. Prior to September 11, if someone had said to me that in order to get into a building, I had to show my fingerprints, I would have gone up to the Supreme Court and back. I don't do that anymore. I actually don't do that anymore. Nothing was a greater, I think, gift to the wishes of, I suppose, the security apparatus that's so important in the global world, than the ability all of a sudden to actually demand of citizens to give up their rights to the privacy we talked about before. Not in all aspects, because in the end, privacy, when you look at the definition of it and its etymology, is actually that which belongs to you and not to the state. We have given so much of our privacy back to the state that we've actually, in a sense, by accident and osmosis, redefined what privacy actually is in the 21st century. And I think that's a discussion well worth having. And by the way, from a business perspective, and so when I talk about this from the ICCs, and we are the most inclusive body when it talks about business issues. So I crowd in views. I have ICCs in Somalia. I have ICC in Afghanistan. We're everywhere, and we crowd the views in. We actually form a view as a consequence of that. The big issue here is trust. And what I worry about with the framing of data as it is, it actually is creating more difficulty in enabling the necessary trust to allow us to shape effective interoperable platforms and interoperable frameworks that will allow data to flow. What you're seeing already, most of you would know, small, medium enterprises comprise something like 70% of the global economy. In some economies, it's 90%. Most SMEs cannot navigate the complexity around access to data and privacy. They just can't. We all wish they could, but they can't. And they also know that they see use of the cloud as an enabler, and it is an enabler. But what's happening now with all the regulatory frameworks that are occurring, the cost of using the cloud is increasing for these guys as well. It's being passed back. So it's actually becoming an inhibitor, this framing so incorrectly of data, the inability then of nations to agree because they see themselves as giving up the new gold, when in fact they should be looking at it as an enabler of trade, of a movement of trade. And of course, movement of trade of goods across borders and services across borders actually helps economic development. And I can give you the count of that. Only 2% of SMEs in Latin America trade across borders. Think about the development opportunities that are missing. And I'm not blaming the opening speaker for the consequence of that. But unless we arrest that kind of discussion, that kind of framing, our ability to create an environment where inclusive economies can allow SMEs to develop will actually be much, much harder than it needs to be. And towards the end, I've been thinking about this. We have this gathering of young leaders of tomorrow. Well, I have a couple of challenges I want to throw out later on as well. So, sorry I didn't actually answer directly your question, but I felt moved to actually make some comments about the general framing, and hopefully in that context, I've dealt with the great contradiction that you're identifying.
Are you also a diplomat?
I've never. Well, I was thrown out of being a diplomat because I actually kind of didn't fit the mold.
I agree with you on the enabler part. Do you know that most of Global South, when it wants to travel to the Global North, you need something called a visa. And for that, you have to give your fingerprint, your retina, and I think short of all your body measurements, nearly everything has to be showed. If you're applying for the first time, you have to give your 3 years of income tax returns, how much you have in your bank balance. So the agent, the service company, and of course the person who's stamping that visa is there. So while you were getting outraged about the fingerprint, I was just thinking about it, that, how does it work? Having said that, in India, a national identity card for some of the poorest people in the world has been enabled with biometrics. That's very critical data for policymakers. There are questions of privacy and control over that, but it has helped a few 100 million people open digital bank accounts. Digital transactions are happening because your identity is very clearly fixed. So I agree with you on the enabler part, but then I come to you, Keith, to talk about the protection and the privacy of it. So at Google, how has the concept of protection of data and privacy evolved from the early days to now?
Sure. So, I mean, a few themes I would love to tease out, because I think my co-panelists did such an incredible job of setting up sort of what privacy is and how thinking about it has evolved and continues to evolve. I would zoom even farther out. If you go back, one of my dear friends and mentors, a gentleman named Jeffrey Rosen, who's the CEO of the National Constitution Center in the US, sort of a titan of legal scholarship, points in one of his books back to the Talmud, and under ancient Talmudic law, there was a concept of an injury that comes from being seen. And the way that they talk about this is, if you put a window in your house that allows you to look into your neighbor's yard in a way that you previously were not able to do so, your neighbor had a cause of action against you, and they could compel you to remove the window because you had created an injury. You had sort of encroached and taken something away from them by virtue of your own action. Fast forward a couple thousand years, and when I was in law school, what feels like ages ago, it was about 25 years ago, I took a class called The Right to Privacy. We barely touched on data protection. What we talked about was Roe v. Wade and a woman's right to self-determination. We talked about the right to exclude someone. We talked about rights of personality, slander, libel, things like that. We really didn't focus on data. And then you fast forward 25 years, and now virtually the entire privacy conversation has centered and orbited around data for the last decade. And now I actually would say we are at another inflection point, because it's not just about data anymore. We're looking at the intersection of so many complicated and challenging issue areas. We're looking at privacy, we're looking at competition, we're looking at harmful content online, we're looking at the rise of new technologies like AI/ML, and how do we appropriately derive value from data to make people's lives better all over around the world. And all of that is just making it. I often encounter these metaphors around data as the new oil, and I share your frustration. I think those are extraordinarily unhelpful. I would counter data as the new sunlight, right? It's ubiquitous, it's infinitely renewable, we can always produce more of it. It can be dangerous if you do not think about it appropriately and recognize the harms that it can cause. But as long as you're responsible in the way that you interact with it, there is a nearly limitless amount of value to be unlocked to make everybody's life better. So how we think about it at Google, I would say, when we think about data and privacy, there are some key themes that have persisted since the company's founding. As many of you may know, our company was organized around the mission of organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful. When that's your mission, you are necessarily going to be actively engaged on the topic of privacy, because you are talking about aggregating, analyzing, and deriving value from data, making it available to people all over the world. You need to be sure that you have guardrails around that you're handling it responsibly. I would say we think about it in terms of control, confidence, and trust. Control, we need to have meaningful controls in place that users all over the world of varying levels of sophistication, varying levels of access to technology, varying levels of education, differing cultural traditions. We need to present common controls as similar as possible everywhere in the world, so that when users are interacting with our technology, they understand what the value exchange is. They understand what information we're collecting and processing about them, what we will use it for, whom we will share it with, and what control they have to dispose of it, to make it go away. They need to have confidence in the fact that representations that we make to them, things that we say in our privacy policy, in our terms of use, things that we say in context in our products themselves, they are honest, they are accurate, and we're going to keep the commitments that we're making to our users. And we need to be consistently transparent around all of that. So, and that last bit, in some respects, has been challenging and will continue to be increasingly challenging over time. When you think about the ubiquity of technology today, when I joined Google 12 years ago, I still thought about the company primarily as something that I interfaced with when I sat down in front of a desktop computer to engage with Google search. Those days almost feel quaint in retrospect, right? Like now, you have access to the world's information on a mobile device that you're carrying around with you every single day. We need to figure out, we need to do as good a job as possible of communicating all of that essential information to you. What information are we collecting about you? How are we using it? What controls, what decisions do you have that will define how that relationship works? And how can you exercise those controls? And how might all of that change over time? That has already been profoundly challenging. We devote a massive amount of time and resource to getting that right. And it's a problem that's never going to be solved because the problem space is becoming infinitely more complicated and complex over time as we think about the way human-machine interfaces are going to evolve, as we think about the fact that more and more of our lives are going to be intermediated by technology. The obligation on companies like Google to get that right and to figure out how do we deliver precisely the right amount of information to people at exactly the right moment, being appropriately disruptive, without damaging the utility of the technology that they're relying upon to live their lives. That's going to be an ongoing challenge, and we're going to have to continue devoting resource to it. We're going to have to continue adapting to get it right.
That's heartening to know, Keith. But let me pause here and ask all of you, how many of you, even today, would be willing to give up maybe a single information or data point about yourself for a free service or product? Raise your hands, please. That's very heartening to know as well. So we are living in the age where we are offering data, but we don't know where it's going. I think that's the key issue. And you spoke of harm as well, and I'm fascinated by that thought. And there is a concept, John, in your wonderful country, which didn't allow you back in, of an e-safety commissioner. And many countries are saying that, data is there. Then there's a concept of your anonymity. So data can be anonymized, but even your presence online can be anonymized. Is that a good thing or not? There is a lot of debate about that. Is that something that is going to be defining the future of data and privacy? John?
Well, I don't know if there's a straight line there. Maybe I put it in the context that I'm comfortable dealing with that question. I think the most important issue with data and data, however, I'm Australian, so
depending
I say
on which
data.
country you are in,
that's right. So just to be clear about pronunciation, so I've done definitions, I've done etymology, now I'm doing pronunciation as well. But the most important thing for me is to actually recognise the mistakes of the past here. And we've seen so many mistakes of the past, particularly...
What is the biggest mistake in the past that you would say we made?
Basically breaking the citizens' bargain. And the citizens' bargain for me was the classic, which was post-Second World War, was that we will, as governments with the citizens, make the following agreement. If you allow us to continue to work on industrialisation, to actually enable the economy work better, to start to open up our markets, open up to open economic settings, and in return, we will give you guarantees about the way in which you will be trained, the way in which schooling will be provided, a social safety net of some form will be developed. That was a citizens' bargain that lasted, in a sense, until the Washington Consensus, which really said, actually, it's going so well, trust us, let's go a little bit further now. Let's deregulate. Let's actually make certain there is very few barriers in the way of open markets, and trust us because there will be a net economic benefit. Let's bring China into the WTO. That's going to be good. Let's actually open all this up. But then you look back and say, hold on, why are citizens now from 2015 saying, I'm not feeling this. I'm not feeling the love you promised me. I'm not seeing it. And we'll say, but on aggregate, it's better. But it's not better in Idaho. It's not better in Wollongong in Australia. And dare I say it, it's not necessarily better in parts of Uttar Pradesh as well. And that's why, in many respects, India has still got some resistance to opening economic markets up. So the fundamental learning there was a breakdown of trust. So one of my aims in the world is to actually live up to the purpose that I set for the ICC, which is to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. We can't do that if people don't trust us. So I've spent a lot of time ensuring that the institution I lead is the world's most trusted business organization, because we're inclusive. I'm getting to the point, so I just wanted to give you that context.
I'm going to bring in Mariana on this word of trust.
Because it's unbelievable that if we can't have, therefore, citizens' trust in the use of their data, and we haven't learned the lesson of what I was just describing before, then the benefits that can accrue from the flow of data, the actual use of data as just the sunshine, there will be shadows everywhere. So it's actually, as we would say, it's human-centric, it's citizen-centric. And that's, by the way, what we say about AI. This has got, I mean, it's creepy if it's not, to be honest with you, but it has to be human-centric. And that's how it has to be viewed. And part of being human is actually enabling the human to trust one another and actually being able to say, no, I don't want to share that with you. And I want to know and be confident that the restraints that are put around the sharing of that are actually honoured. And that's one of the pieces that I think is important. And that's why an e-commerce commissioner may well be a good thing, or e-commerce or an e-safety commissioner could be a great thing. Anything that gives citizens confidence that what has been said to them has integrity and can be trusted. So,
but, you know, the fact is a lot of people would not trust the government or the private sector, but they would want regulation, right, Mariana?
Not quite right, though. If you look at the longitudinal studies, the most trusted entities in the world are actually business leaders, but you actually have to cut the data a little bit further. Business leaders
Should I take a poll? May I take a poll on this? Are business leaders the most, let's see how many hands will go up here. Are business leaders the most trusted community?
This is an eccentric group, let's face it.
Really, but let's get this question. Let's get the question to everybody. Are business leaders the most trusted amongst all stakeholders? How many people believe that?
What are the options?
Yeah, let me argue with the guy asking the question. Yeah. Okay, do you want a panel or do you want agreement?
Look, John, I'm sorry, but nobody raised their hand.
I know. I'm just referring to the Edelman Trust Barometer, and the most recent one that's come out 3 years in a row has actually listed business as the entity, the business leaders as the entities and the individuals most trusted over universities, over government, over the media, over commentators. That's all.
I think, as you said, we'll have to, you know, ignore this eccentric bunch,
that's
but
right, yeah.
go to Mariana.
Let me take that, yeah. I think I'll try to build on top of that, because I think the question is how you build trust, right? And I don't think people are really ready to just trust patterns that are being built by corporations or by governments. And I think when we think of the past and the multiple violations, data breaches that happened involving data privacy, I think people lost a lot of trust in how their data is being handled and how both the private sector and governments are dealing with data. And I think that speaks to one of the questions of this panel, and then I'll get to your question on safety and all of those things, which is this supposed trade-off between a data-driven economy and privacy, which I think doesn't really exist. I think it only exists if we assume that it's inevitable that technology will develop a certain way, or that data will be gathered and used freely and there's nothing we can do about it. I think we had a very important lesson with the GDPR in the EU, where we start to see privacy as governance, as a process, right? Where we start to see that for companies, it was also important to have procedures to follow, but that we don't have to be going from one scandal to the other. We need to shape what it is to comply with data privacy, right? And I think that builds trust, and that builds trust especially if this is a process that involves the participation, if people see themselves contemplated in those rules, which of course is not always going to be the case, but I think there's a movement towards that. It was built on top of public conversation. And I think that's the part that's really important. And that's the part that's really important that we discuss right now, because I think the AI discussion is moving more or less in the same direction of like inevitability. There's nothing we can do about it. We can't regulate it. There's nothing to be done. And there's nothing inevitable about it. We've had like decades now of history of digital technologies to know that just thinking that involves like taking too long to take measures. So that's one thing. I don't think that trade-off exists. I think we can really shape how things are going. That doesn't mean controlling every detail of how technology is developed. That means I was speaking to someone during lunch. She was mentioning, she's here in the audience, she was mentioning like, it's not letting the river flow, but building margins around it, which have to do with societal interests, which have to do with the subjects that we're discussing here, right? Which are intergenerational contracts, but also I think we have to think of global contracts in that respect, because then I'm mentioning the GDPR, but we're mentioning global companies that are using data, and of course, many countries, developing countries, don't have the same level of data protection. We don't want to be developing exploitative measures in those countries as well. So it's just a call for us to think also globally about this. I think this is a very important subject. And just to the point that you made about safety, anonymity, I think that speaks more or less to the question, like, is there too much privacy, too little privacy? I think we can also take that question in a little more complex way. I also don't think we have exactly a trade-off there, which is not to not admit that anonymity, it can encourage certain acts of violence online, right? I think there are a lot of studies around that, but at the same time, when we're speaking of violence of vulnerable populations, we also have to be reminded that privacy is very important for them as well. So if we're speaking of violence against women, for example, a woman who is under a situation of domestic violence, for example, for her it's really important to have encrypted communications, right? So just we frame this well, because I think this is often framed also as a trade-off. And again, I think we can move to another direction if we look at this with more granularity and really facing what the problems are from a local and global perspective.
That's very well said, Mariana. Thank you. Keith, technology is moving, and after this, I'd like to bring all of you into the discussion. Please keep your questions ready, but don't throw anything else at the panelists. Keith, technology is moving so fast, and generative AI is moving. So we know about the fact that in just less than 2 months, 60 days, ChatGPT got 100 million followers, fastest in the world. And between November and now, there are several versions. And by the time we meet next year, I don't know who will be, maybe there will be AI running this panel. I don't know. But the fact is, there have been instances where people have put information into such generative AI tools to get information, to get analysis, reasoning, right? And that data is also voluntary data for business, John, to get a business outcome out of it, analyze an insurance policy, for example, or a corporate judgment, and get insights. My question to you, where do we go from here in terms of data and privacy? I think the definitions are changing very fast, but our ability to comprehend the approach to managing it, I think, is falling far behind. We talk often of regulation falling behind, but I think even the technology creators, business owners, and us as citizens and consumers are unable to grasp the speed of change. Where are we headed?
That's a great question. I mean, sort of coming back to one of John's points on this notion of trust.
You still have to answer my question.
Well, I will, and I will. But to set it up, we need to understand this notion of trust. And this notion, actually, I see similar research to what John has said, that some of the corporate brands, ourselves included, that are at the center of the global debate around privacy are among the most trusted brands in the world. Doesn't mean we always get it right, doesn't mean that there aren't questions or concerns about what we do with data, but it means that I think, on balance, our motives ought to be relatively clear. And I think that is a really interesting thing to focus on and unpack. When you're talking about nation states, when you're talking about political actors, sometimes it is difficult to fully discern with a high level of confidence what their core motivations are. It's a broader conversation for another day. And I think that's exacerbated by the fact that, yes, there's an academic, intellectual argument that state actors have, under certain circumstances, a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, which amplifies the consequences of the way that you tease out that conversation. When you're talking about a private actor, you assume it has a certain predefined, discernible number of objectives, right? It shouldn't be exclusively profit maximization, although that will, of course, be a consideration for commercial actors. We have a growing, important, and compelling discussion around ESG. What are the roles of corporations in society? How can they be forces for good in the universe? I would say at Google, when we distill down the way we think about the world, we need to deliver useful products for users. If we fail in that mission, then we cease to exist. Right? If we succeed in that mission, we will grow and prosper, our shareholders will benefit, human society will benefit, regulators may back off, like assuming that we're making the trade-offs appropriately. When I look at the rate of change in technology, if I think about my own field, right? So I've focused on data protection for 25-ish years. In that space, frequently the conversation went roughly along the lines of technology is moving at a dizzying rate. The way that it is affecting people's lives is historically unprecedented, very difficult to understand, and extremely complex. And the way that users are interacting with it, users will engage with technology and deploy it in ways that were novel and often unanticipated, right? So we have been tangling with that cluster of problems for decades in the context of data protection. It has accelerated over, say, the last 15 years dramatically, perhaps reaching a crescendo around 2018 when Europe passed the GDPR. They really dropped a marker and they created a tremendous catalyst for global focus and attention on data protection as an area of legislative and regulatory focus. They implemented 4% global annual turnover civil penalties, which made it a board-level consideration in every publicly traded company in the world, where companies historically should have, and many were thinking about it. Everybody suddenly acknowledged a fiduciary duty to be thinking about how data protection affects your business model. That has been profoundly challenging. I've been in the middle of that riptide of policy considerations and technology considerations for over a decade, and we have made incredible progress. We have built strong accountability programs, strong governance measures. The law has evolved tremendously. Again, the GDPR is one manifestation of a very mature, highly realized...
Sorry to interrupt. Do you also feel that sometimes the technology is going faster than you at Google can understand?
I think the rate of change in technology and just the sheer complexity of technology now eludes human comprehension. Right? And I think anyone who's having a candid conversation about it will say that. So the challenge now is recognizing that. How do we behave responsibly as custodians of technology, as change agents? And I think the most responsible thing we can do, where I was headed with my remarks before, is we've done a lot of good work in data protection. There is a tremendous focus right now in the data protection space. People who have focused on privacy, who have built their careers around privacy, both in-house as well as regulators themselves, are now seeing some of the skills, some of the advances that we made in trying to get privacy and data protection right seem to be relevant for the challenges that we see taking shape on the horizon in the context of AI/ML, around data governance, AI/ML risk management. How do you create programmatic administrative, procedural, and technical controls inside of organizations to make sure that you're behaving responsibly and releasing technologies into production in a way that you have sufficiently appropriately anticipated the benefits to users on the one side and the potential risks on the other, and you're mitigating those risks to the greatest extent possible. It is tempting, and I'm seeing some distortion right now where folks are overly analogizing privacy to AI/ML. That's a mistake. The vast majority of the challenge in the AI/ML space is not privacy related. The vast majority of the data that we are going to be processing to do incredible things in the AI/ML space will not be personal data. And it'll be interesting as we see this ecosystem evolve. There will be products from us and others that will, in fact, try to do incredible things with personal information, and they ought to be very strictly scrutinized. They should have extremely robust controls in place to advance those objectives I was talking about before, so users understand what's going on, so that they maintain control, and so that they can actually opt into and opt out of that system over time as the product evolves. But the vast majority of what's happening, what we're seeing from LLMs right now, to the extent personal data manifests in these systems, it's often a bug, not a feature. It's typically, that's not the data that you want to be processing. That's not what you want to be looking at, because that typically will fall on the risk side of the equation rather than the benefit side of the equation. So we're working very hard at Google, and I know others are working in the ecosystem to try to continue innovating to minimize dependency on personal data. Let's make the challenges of AI/ML not privacy challenges. Let's separate these challenge spaces as best we can, and then port over the learning around data governance, risk management, and compliance. What have we figured out over the last 20 years in privacy? How do we deploy those learnings in AI/ML? Now, I will say the very real challenge that I think folks who are paying attention are seeing, we had decades to think about this in privacy, and still the conversation was dominated by observations from people saying it was moving so fast, it was hard to keep up, it was moving at this dizzying pace, and it was straining the ability of regulators, legislative, and policymakers to keep up. AI/ML is moving materially faster, right? So we have less time, changes coming more quickly, there is a tremendous amount of pressure, and I think I take that responsibility very, very seriously. I think we have an awesome obligation. I think anyone who wants to be a change agent, who wants to drive this new generational contract going forward and sees AI/ML, I think rightly, as a tremendous opportunity to do that, needs to be paying close attention, learn from the lessons of the past, but recognize we're going to have to move much more quickly for this next phase.
Thank you, Keith. That's quite a forceful and with great force that you've been able to articulate the issues that we need to look at. But let's get some thoughts from all of you. Now we see raised hands. Okay, excellent. So I think we need another 2 hours for those raised hands, but let me try to start with you over here. And right, okay.
Thank you so much.
I should have stopped half an hour ago.
That's all right. I'll be very brief. Hi, my name is Trina. I'm with the UN SDG Lab in Geneva. And I'm wondering if the panel has a reflection on the agency of citizens, because I feel like we've been talking a lot about citizens as someone who rejects or accepts cookies. And I'm sure that we can go beyond that. So within the sustainability space, there's a lot of focus now on citizen-generated data. But I'm also thinking that there's surely more that we can do where we can take ownership and even, I don't know, sell our data, other creative ideas, but sort of how do we take back the data and how do we give more agency to citizens beyond just the passive sort of accepting or rejecting? Because I think we've had mostly a focus on the corporate and the policymakers, which are clearly sort of responding to public demands, but I think that would be an interesting reflection.
Let me collect a couple of questions and come to the panel. So, please introduce yourself and keep it brief. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Jochen Dürr. I'm the Chief Risk Officer of the Swiss Stock Exchange Group, and we operate a highly regulated financial market infrastructure in both Switzerland and Spain, in addition to a global data business as well. And I'd like to touch upon Keith's remarks just before, the point on regulation. Yeah? I see an increasingly growing, what I call regulatory unlevel playing field when it comes to how a company can successfully operate globally in using data or not. Yeah? So if we could elaborate on that topic a little bit more and what your thoughts would be how a company can be successful, why obviously requiring to adhere to all the standards that are coming, often unclear yet, in some countries more pronounced, in some countries less, that would be great.
Thank you. I'll take one more question. I think right at the back, I like the backbenchers there. Yes, right at the back, please.
Hi, my name is Birte, and I'm a consumer researcher from Switzerland. Talking about privacy, I would like to know your stance on the right to be forgotten, whether there's a point at which data needs to be deleted to ensure privacy. Thank you.
Let's come back to the panel. You're free to pick any of the questions, but Keith, there was one for you directly.
Well, I don't think any of these are relevant for me. So, so let me take a run at each of these, because I actually think I have a perspective on each of them.
And I'll request all three of you to also give a very quick answer so that we can get more.
Certainly. All right, so I'll start with the first one, on agency of citizens. I want to turn this one upside down for just a second. I think it's an incredibly rich area, because I do think at the end of the day, all of this is ultimately about individual users all around the world. If we are not optimizing for their interests, then we are failing. There is a very real challenge right now in that there is a tendency when we focus on consent as the primary mechanism by which a company can confirm that it is on the right side of the law or the right side of regulation before it processes user data. That is very tempting. In some policy conversations around the world, they rotate heavily there, saying this is the gold standard in terms of a basis for processing, if you need a legal basis for processing. When sophisticated people sort of dig into that conversation, they realize what is ultimately actually happening there is an inappropriate transfer of responsibility away from the corporate actor onto the individual user, right? If all we have to do is create a disruptive consent moment for users for every individual data processing activity that we want to do, and in doing that, we absolve ourselves of any responsibility to behave appropriately, what we're going to do is a bunch of things. We're going to destroy the utility of the technologies that people have come to rely upon. They're going to become way more disruptive. They're going to be less delightful. They're going to be less productive. And we're going to create consent fatigue because people are going to be overwhelmed by so many of those moments where they're being forced to make choices, often in a time-constrained environment with incomplete information, that it will be sort of the privacy policy terms of use issue where everyone will just click through and they won't read. And even though you'll be getting consent everywhere, it will be meaningless. So that's what failure looks like. I agree with what you were saying. There is a tremendous opportunity to leverage technology, especially the innovations that are happening now, as we look at AI/ML, as we look at sort of the next generation of chatbots, as we look at the next generation of products. How do we exploit the tremendous power that these technologies are going to bring to enhance user control? That's where I actually think there's a significant opportunity. It's not going to be about moving faster in all instances, and it's certainly not going to be about reducing user transparency. There is this incredibly complex balancing act that we need to engage in. How do we figure out precisely the right amount of information to give users at the appropriate moment to empower them? If we do that well, and if we do it efficiently, we're going to unlock an incredible amount of value, and then business models will emerge from that, right? If you look at what has happened over the last 20 years, again, everybody has had access to virtually all human knowledge on a very inexpensive device that they can carry around with them all the time. Largely from an ad-supported business model, how do we figure out other ways to transfer value so that users are realizing the incredible value of these new technologies that they unlock as they go over time?
So, I'll have to stop you there, Keith, because we're running out of time. Just to tell you that Keith and Mariana would be here, so you could also interact with them later. John has to leave. But Mariana, quickly, your take on the questions.
I'll try also to take the first one because I think it also refers to something I said before. I was mentioning that many users will choose to give out data because they get benefits from it. And of course, that's also a simplification, right? I think there are choices there to be made. I think one of the important discussions to be made there is that sometimes that choice is not present, of course, when it comes, for example, to price of technologies or to data gathered by governments and everything. But of course, there are decisions on the individual level, which are important, which users are making all the time, right? Citizens are making all the time. I think you also referred to another dimension, which is citizen organization for this, right? There's a lot of literature on that, on the difficulty also of doing that because of the decentralized nature of the interest, right? We're not speaking of like homogeneous people who can organize in a union, for example, right? We're speaking of like users at large and also of things that would require technology, which is expensive, right? So we're thinking, for example, of technology that would allow me to decide what and when to share and when to take it back. And that requires, of course, a lot of development. And then we have to be, I think that's a very interesting path to go. Then we also have to discuss funding to these activities, right? And how to develop them. But just to make sure that I do think there's a choice and I do think there's a power in like organizing it from the side of civil society. I'm not really taking the second one because I think it was mostly for you. There was a question on the right to be forgotten.
Yes, right to be forgotten.
Yeah, I think I should address that. That's a difficult one. I think that the right to be forgotten, so the problem is the framing of it, right? But let's say the right of someone to have information that's inaccurate, that's irrelevant, that's like all the criteria about them deleted, I think that's important and I think that's something that we should fight for. I don't think that every information about citizens should be online on this perspective of like radical, extreme access to information. But of course, the devil lies in the details, right? So like how do you build such a policy in a way that you also do not create possibilities for powerful actors to try to hide criticism about them, right? So I think the difficulty is really like in building the instrument, but in my opinion, that's an important right that we can't take for granted. So one of the things I was also discussing today is if I ask ChatGPT to write a profile about me and it gives me something slightly inaccurate, that's like I don't like, that's like one issue, right? But if ChatGPT gives a result, and that's not just for me, it could be for you, for example, that says something completely inaccurate about me or something that perhaps is true, but it has been a very long time, it's irrelevant, it's something that is harming me, shouldn't there be a way for citizens also to be able to fight that? That can be really, really harmful, right? So just to state that I think it's an important thing that we should be discussing.
That's an important point. John, we have 2 minutes left.
Okay, quickly, and I want to throw something out. On this issue of agency, it's very interesting for me. I mean, we were on a campaign in Latin America, just for example, called Yo Soy Empresario. What it really says is that everybody can have agency in order to be a business person, okay? And what we're saying is that an individual who chooses to cut hair on the side of the road is a business person. We also develop the skills to enable people to participate in the economy. We've created these centers of entrepreneurship in Africa, in Latin America. We even have one for Ukraine for the refugees because we want to, the idea of it is to enable them to earn a livelihood to support their families or whomever they choose to support. It was provoked because I was asked by civil society to go to Beirut in the midst of the crisis when people had given up hope, saying, can you come and build something which is useful here for us? Because everyone was saying, well, people need to get a job. There are no jobs. And so looking at these very issues that you talked about, people can have agency, but we need to help them. And part of that agency we find is the digital economy. We're actually giving them the skills to operate in it, how they join up their photography with their goods to payment platforms, this sort of stuff. It can actually create a living. So I think that's a really important piece of this. The issue you raised, which is really around the uneven playing field, this goes to the heart of the issue I'm talking about. Unless we can come to an agreement on an interoperable platform that enables this, where everyone understands and is traded and there's values, etc., value created that people accept, you will not get there. And at the moment, we're not getting there. In fact, Japan tried it, but of course they launched it in the wrong spot at the G7. The Global South does not accept the diktat of the G7 as to how the global world should operate. I mean, it's kind of just old think. You've got to actually launch it differently. What I've been thinking, we're thinking about this all the time, about how do you create frameworks to enable global cooperation. Critically, it has to be multi-stakeholder. But a stakeholder that's generally missing is next generation. And so what we've been doing is creating capstone projects with various institutions of higher learning where there's genuine interest in this stuff. And I see the title around this is for young leaders, so I thought I'll throw it out. So one of the things we'd be very interested in doing at the ICC with St.Gallen is actually working to establish the principles that can actually support the creation of a governance mechanism that we can take forward. I mean, I sit on the Global Crisis Response Group with Guterres and that sort of stuff on the crisis in food, energy. I'm just about to handle we're responsible for debt and liquidity crisis. I want to take this in because the Internet Governance Forum needs a bit of revitalisation. There's actually a bunch of things that could happen. So I'm throwing that out as an opportunity for, I mean, I've got a lot of people who work on this sort of stuff. I can crowd in experts from the Global South, the Global North, all sorts of businesses. A bit we would like to have is next generation. I mean, I can do it myself, but I thought, given you guys are kind of organised, well, why don't I be efficient and see if there's any interest in being part of that challenge? So I leave at 0000, I'll finish that.
Thank you so much, John. I will close with 3 words. For all stakeholders, what is important today and for the future is to be aware, to be alert, and be extremely agile in how we respond to data sharing and its privacy. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have an announcement to make, which is that there's a 45-minute break.